All right, today we are diving into a moment in history that didn't just close a chapter, it slammed the book shut on an entire era. We're talking about the 1956 Suez Crisis.
And you might think that sounds a little dramatic, but honestly, it's no exaggeration at all. The story of Suez is so much more than just a waterway. It's really about this massive collision of fading empires, fiery new nationalism, and the brutal birth of a new world order, one dominated by two brand new titans.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at why this one canal was so incredibly important. Then, we'll get into the man who decided to challenge that old power structure. We're going to uncover a wild, secret plot for war, watch how the world reacted, which was not what they expected, and finally, we'll see just how deep the consequences of this crisis really went. Okay, so let's set the stage with the canal itself. In the middle of the 20th century, it is almost impossible to overstate how important this thing was, especially to Great Britain. It wasn't just some convenient shortcut, you know? It was a symbol, it was a strategic necessity, it was everything. Britain's connection to this canal went way back. I mean, after it opened in 1869, they moved fast to get a piece of the action, and eventually just occupied Egypt to make sure they had total control. By the 1950s, this wasn't just about ships and trade routes anymore. It was about the very lifeblood of industrial Europe, oil. 2/3. Just let that sink in. 2 out of every 3 barrels of oil that were powering Europe's factories, their cars, their homes, it all came through this one single strip of water. If you controlled the canal, you basically had your hand on the power switch for Europe's entire economy. And nobody got this more than the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden. When he said this, he wasn't just being poetic. This wasn't some fancy political soundbite. To him, the canal literally was the jugular vein of the British Empire. And the thought of losing control of it, that wasn't just an economic problem. It felt like an existential threat. But, the world doesn't stand still. The old colonial empires were getting weaker, and this new, powerful wave of nationalism was sweeping across the globe. And in the Middle East, the face of that movement was the charismatic new leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So Nasser had this grand vision for Egypt, the Aswan High Dam. It was this massive project meant to control the Nile, generate huge amounts of electricity, and really pull Egypt into the modern industrial age. He went to the West for the money, but when the US and the UK backed out, pointing to his growing relationship with the Soviets, Nasser was left high and dry. He was humiliated, and he needed a new source of cash, fast. And that's when he looked around and saw a giant foreign-owned cash machine running right through his own country. So on July 26, 1956, he pulled the trigger. He nationalized the Suez Canal. In this incredible, fiery speech, he declared that the canal belonged to the people of Egypt, and all its money would now go to building the Aswan Dam. For Egyptians, this was a moment of incredible national pride. But for Britain and France, well, this was basically a declaration of war. Predictably, diplomacy just fell apart. Britain and France were absolutely furious. They saw Nasser as this tin-pot dictator who they could not trust with their jugular vein. And so, behind closed doors, a conspiracy started to brew. And it included a third partner that had its own very different reasons for wanting to take a shot at Egypt: Israel. And this is where the whole thing just goes full-on spy thriller. Seriously. You've got representatives from Britain, France, and Israel meeting in total secrecy in a villa outside of Paris, trying to hash out a plan. What came out of it was the Protocol of Sèvres, this detailed three-way blueprint for a coordinated invasion, all while they were publicly claiming they were still looking for a peaceful solution. Okay, so check out this plan. It was as clever as it was totally deceptive. Step 1, Israel invades Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Step 2, Britain and France then swoop in, pretending to be these neutral peacekeepers, and they issue an ultimatum demanding that both sides pull back from the canal. Now, since Egypt was, being invaded, they were obviously going to refuse. And that was the whole point. That refusal would give Britain and France the perfect excuse to invade, seize the canal, and claim they were just there to keep the peace. The whole scheme depended on this huge gap between the public story and the secret reality. Publicly, it was all about stopping a war and protecting international shipping. But the real goals, the secret ones, seize the canal, get rid of Nasser, and basically put a stop to this wave of Arab nationalism that was threatening their old colonial influence. And so the trap was set.
They were so confident. They thought they could get this done quickly, and that the world, especially their good friends in America, would just kind of shrug and accept it once it was all over. Wow, they could not have been more wrong.
On October 29th, the first domino fell. Israeli troops poured into the Sinai. Right on cue, Britain and France issued their fake ultimatum, and when Nasser, of course, rejected it, their bombs started falling on Egyptian airfields. The invasion was on.
Militarily, the operation was actually going pretty well for them. But politically? Oh, it was an absolute catastrophe. Instead of the world just accepting it, they were hit with this firestorm of global outrage. The Soviet Union saw a huge opportunity and started making noise, even vaguely threatening nuclear strikes. The UN voted overwhelmingly for a ceasefire. But the most shocking and most damaging opposition came from their closest ally. The United States was livid. I mean, President Eisenhower felt completely betrayed. He was in the middle of a re-election campaign, and here were his closest allies starting a throwback colonial war behind his back, risking pushing the entire Arab world straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. His public condemnation was swift, and it was brutal. But the blow that actually ended it all wasn't military. It was financial. The U.S. basically aimed an economic weapon right at Britain. They threatened to start selling off their massive holdings of the British pound. For a country like Britain still struggling to recover from World War II, this would have caused a total currency collapse. It was a threat they simply couldn't ignore. Checkmated. Britain and France were forced into a humiliating ceasefire and a complete withdrawal. The actual fighting had only lasted a few days, but the consequences would reshape the entire globe for decades. The crisis was over, but a totally new era had just begun. So when the dust finally settled, the results were just stark. For Britain and France, it was a humiliating disaster. They were exposed as paper tigers who couldn't make a major move without America's permission. Their global prestige was shattered. Eden resigned in disgrace. For Nasser, it was the exact opposite. Yeah, he lost on the battlefield, but politically, it was a massive victory. He became a hero across the Arab world. But the real winners? The two countries that weren't even in the fight, the USA and the Soviet Union. They stepped right into the power vacuum that Britain and France left behind. And the U.S. did not waste any time making its new role official. Just a few months later, they issued the Eisenhower Doctrine. It sent a crystal-clear message to the world. America was now the main protector of Western interests in the Middle East, and it was ready to step in to counter any Soviet influence. The old guards were out, the new sheriff was in town. And at the end of the day, that's the real takeaway. Suez was the moment the world could no longer pretend that the age of European empires wasn't over. It was their last desperate gasp to turn back the clock, and its failure was the final confirmation that from now on, global power would be defined by the rivalry between Washington and Moscow. Which kind of leaves us with a big question for our own time, doesn't it? Because power is always shifting. If Suez was such a clear dividing line for the 20th century, what are the events happening right now that future historians are going to look back on and say, yep, that's when everything changed for the 21st century? The Suez Crisis was such a pivotal moment in the Cold War. And if you want to understand more about that whole defining conflict, you should definitely check out the other explainers we have in our playlist. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep connecting the dots of history together.